Merci bien, Monsieur le Président, et je remercie aussi mon cher ami, l'envoyé spécial, Monsieur Geir Pedersen, pour sa présence et sa participation. Mr. President, when the United States steals openly 200,000 oil barrels from the Syrian oil fields on a daily basis, and when it also steals 400,000 tons of cotton and sets fire to thousands of hectares of wheat fields, and when it steals 5 million livestock, bragging about dividing Syria and deliberately weakening the value of the Syrian pound, when the United States imposes economic coercive measures aiming at suffocating the Syrian people, when the United States occupies parts of my country and protects its Turkish partner that occupies other swath of territories of Syria, when my colleague, the permanent representative of the United States, however, talks about her administration concern of the deteriorated living situation of the Syrian citizens, attributing such deterioration to what she calls the regime, then the legitimate question here becomes the following. Does that not indicate an acute illness situation? Aren't these the symptoms of political schizophrenia? On May 31st, 2020, my country submitted a formal complaint to the Secretary General of the United Nations and the President of the Security Council against some of the governments of member states, at the forefront of which are the United States, the UK, France, and Turkey. Over the past 9 years, the governments of those countries have supported, financed, and armed multinational terrorist organizations and groups with multiple loyalties and labels, and separatist proxy militias. Furthermore, they have deliberately, militarily intervened in my country through unilateral and tripartite acts of aggression, the occupation of parts of Syrian territory, the commission of murder, destruction, displacement, and demographic change, the looting of natural and historical resources and riches, including oil, gas, and antiquities and agricultural crops, burning and destroying what they cannot steal, and imposing more unilateral coercive economic measures on the Syrian people. These practices and the gross violations of the principles of international law and the provisions of the Charter of the United Nations highlight a contradiction in these governments' vision of multilateral international action and a return to the perspective of the League of Nations, which, as we all know, legitimized aggression and occupation, dooming itself to failure. These practices are blatant attempts at the destructive intervention in the political process facilitated by the United Nations through the special envoy of the Secretary General, with the aim of diverting it from a path based on the Syrian national dialogue, with Syrian ownership and leadership, to a form of imposition of these countries' will and dictates on the United Nations at the expense of the Syria's sovereignty, natural resources, and well-being, and the security of its own people. Mr. President, in light of the statements we just heard, I find myself obligated to clarify a few concepts. The policies of blockade and imposition of unilateral coercive measures have been and continue to be an integral part of the blind, prejudiced Western policies and the other side of terrorism that has reaped the lives of Syrians and destroyed their achievements, harming the Syrian people through targeting their national currency, medicine, and livelihood, and the obstruction of the ability of state institutions to meet their basic needs and continue to provide public services, denies any Western claims of humanitarian concern. The latest example of the attempt to harm the Syrian people is manifested in the burning of humanitarian food shipments by some Lebanese parties. These shipments have been regularly provided by the World Food Programme to the Syrians in need through the Lebanese territories for years. The United States administration and the European Union have flouted all international demands for putting an end to the unilateral coercive measures imposed on the Syrian people, including the calls of the Secretary General and his special envoy to Syria, and their renewal and intensification of the effects of those measures, in parallel with the entry into force of the so-called Caesar Act of the United States. All of the above represent a disregard of the American administration and the European Union for all the achievements of humanity accumulated in the field of international law, and an attempt to impose American and European law on the world. James Jeffrey's recent statement represents an explicit recognition by the US administration of its direct responsibility for the suffering of Syrians. Such an irresponsible statement reaffirms that the administration views the region with Israeli eyes, because the demands that Jeffrey is talking about are renewed, old Israeli demands aimed at shaping the region in a way that achieves its hegemonic agenda. Maintaining international peace and security, which the three permanent Western members of the Security Council are supposed to be particularly entrusted with, is not in line with the way these same countries and other Western governments, as well as their tools, turn a blind eye to the practices of their NATO ally, Turkey, for they fully adopt and defend its crimes in Syria, Libya, and other countries. It is also inconsistent with ignoring the American-Turkish occupation of parts of my country, shamelessly sponsoring terrorism and separatist militias there, and holding meetings between representatives of the governments of these two countries and terrorist organizations on the soil of my country. This was recently demonstrated by the infiltration of the Turkish defense and interior ministers into the Syrian territory of the Syrian governorate of Idlib. They have taken advantage of the calm period that prevailed after Moscow agreement to reinforce the presence of the Turkish occupation forces and their affiliated terrorist groups operating in that area. Moreover, the Turkish regime is currently seeking to replace the Syrian national currency with the Turkish currency in the areas it occupies in Syria. It also persists in its attempt at the Turkification of these areas. Here, Erdogan's forces are identical to Israel's in their occupation of territories from my country, namely speaking the Golan, the Syrian Golan. The Turkish and Israeli occupations are complementary and harmonious in serving their American operator. Further, maintaining international peace and security is not in line with the resolve of the three permanent Western member states and the Security Council not to eliminate the terrorist organization of ISIS as they mobilize its remnants in Iraq and Syria, whenever the interest of these states require. In my statement delivered on May the 19th, 2020, I referred to confessions of ISIS terrorists captured by the Syrian Arab Army, in which they stressed the fact that they were trained by the American occupation forces in the Syrian-occupied region of Al-Tanf. Recently, an ISIS terrorist named Mohammed Hussein Saud confessed that the British intelligence forced him, along with other terrorists, to work for it and tasked them to gather information on Syrian and Russian military locations and institutions in Syria. Mr. President, in its official complaint, my country requested the Secretary General and the Security Council to put an end to the hostile foreign interventions in the domestic affairs of my country, as well as to commit all member states to refrain from any practices aiming at undermining the independence and course of the political process, affecting the interests and the choices of the Syrian people, the safety and stability of Syria, as well as its regional and international relations. Furthermore, Syria requested the Secretary General to mandate the specialized legal organs in the Secretariat to prepare an immediate report on how the American and European laws and legislations of imposing an economic embargo on the Syrian people are in line with the provisions of the Charter and related Security Council resolutions on Syria. This report should also highlight the catastrophic impacts of those measures on the lives of the Syrian people. My country, ladies and gentlemen, looks forward to the response of the Secretary General to this request and to be informed as soon as possible of what procedures are taken along with his mandate and capacity in facilitating the political process in the Syrian Arab Republic. Finally, Mr. President, we have always been a victim of settling Western scores. Therefore, we are good readers of history. The problem with our enemies and rivals is that we read history differently. In this regard, it would be suitable to recall what a wise social politician once said, I quote, "Only fools defy history," unquote. I would like to say to my colleagues, representatives of the Western countries in this Council, lift your pressures off my country, Syria. Let the Syrian people breathe. Merci, Monsieur le Président.